Please confirm. Good. Hello, Oliver. So good to see you. I haven't seen you for a long for a while. How are you?
Alex, it's great to meet you again. And I think of our fun days walking on the beach in South Africa, dealing with the sailors and the. I think we were dealing with the whole area of kidnappings as well at that stage.
Wow. And basically, it's quite interesting because the first time I met you was in South Africa. It was more than 10 years ago. And that time you were giving us a training on crisis response. It was in the females monastery somewhere in mountains. Do you remember the time?
I do. And in fact, I met two Irish nuns while we were there. And I always felt I got a better breakfast than you.
Yeah, it was absolutely amazing. And I should say that you were the person who encouraged me and involved me in the topic of the crisis response that time. And since then, there was a lot of changes in my life. I also was graduated as a clinical psychologist, to do this work more professionally. But anyway, I still remember our talks and your expertise and your explanations about your work as the main supporter in the Ministry of Defense of the Irish Army. Your talks about Darfur and other missions you took part in. So it's a big honor for me to have you here today.
Delighted, Alex. Anything to support my colleagues in the military and your own personal experiences within the countries. Delighted to be of assistance in any way I can.
Excellent. Oliver, I have several questions.
Okay.
The crisis response protocols.
Hmm.
Could you please describe the protocol or approach you use for planning and providing crisis response? I mean, do you use different approaches, for instance, for military personnel, civilians, individuals, or groups? How does it work?
Okay, yeah. So the first thing I would say to you is you have to look at a strategic plan. So when I get a request, let's say I'll give you an example, that tragic bombing that took place in Beirut at the harbor where they were storing multiple items of explosives in it. The response for that came in by way of a phone call from a non-government organization. So if you give an example of looking at how would I plan that? Well, the first thing I would look at is the theme, THEME, the theme, what's behind it? So what's behind it is what happened. So it was an accident, but it's a bombing. And in a country like Lebanon, Lord God, I spent 2-3 years there working as a military with the United Nations, and their country is still torn apart, unfortunately, like your own at the moment in relation to war. So you have to look at that. What impact would that have on the people as well? Do they think it's another occupying force after causing it? So what happened? What is the nature of the event? How awful or how serious is the event? And then what are the threats? Are there other threats? Is there another explosion? Is there a come on from that aspect of it? So that's the first thing I would look at. Then, unfortunately, being a military man, I fall back into military terminology. And then I talk about the targets. But what I mean by targets is who or what types of groups are involved. So this is where I start breaking it down now into for a response. So think of this as a strategic plan. So I'm looking at the targets, who's impacted by the incident, how many people are involved, because that will depend on how many of us have to respond. Are there individuals? Are there homogeneous groups? In other words, are there groups of military? Are there groups of civilians? Are there groups of emergency services? So I'm beginning to sort of structure, how do I respond to the different groups? And then are there identifiable groups within it? So like the military, like the police, like the emergency services and civilians. So now I'm looking at how do I break that down? The next thing then I look at, because this is in the initial response, I look at the types of interventions that I might be able to carry out. So because I have the groups, I now look at each of those groups and see what's best for them. So am I talking about individuals? Are there individuals in it? Are there different types of groups in it that I could put together that might have a peer structure themselves? So are there homogeneous groups, that something that they have in common? Or tragically, were they just people passing by the docks that day? They would be a totally different group. So I'm looking at, because there is no intervention that fits every situation. So if I look at who's involved, because I might have to do one-to-ones with individuals. I might have to do psychoeducation with certain groups.
Yeah.
I may do critical incident stress debriefing with other groups. But you can't decide that until you meet the groups, but you have them broken down. The next one then I look at it is the timing.
Okay.
When am I going to provide those interventions that I've looked at for the groups? It's interesting in the one in Beirut was because it was so far away, it was a time of war, and it was also the time at the height of the COVID-19. So all of our responses were actually done as we're doing now through Zoom. So in fairness, I didn't know what Zoom was pre-COVID. Now I see the advantages of it. So, out of every trauma, we should learn and take those learned lessons, which we don't do, unfortunately. So then the timing is, the order of who am I going to respond to? Who are the emergency people that need the priorities? Have I got groups? And then the next thing then is, Alex, in our case, who's our team? Have we a team? I can't just respond to a multi-agency response on my own. So who have I got? And if I look at your group, the way you're continuing with your education within Ukraine at the moment, taking your group together, doing ideal trainings with one another, now you know who's there and you know who you can select and bring forward with you. So that's the way I would do a strategic plan. The 5 T's, the theme, what's happened, the target group, the types of people that are involved, individuals, groups, or emergency services, the types of intervention that I'm going to provide for those different groups, the timing of that, when am I going to do that? And then lastly, where have we got the team that we would have? So it doesn't matter whether it's a military event or whether it's a civilian event. That's the way I would do my strategic plan in planning for an event like that.
And as far as I understood, your approach may vary depending on case by case. It doesn't mean, for instance, you mentioned critical incident stress debriefing. So, but this is not the only approach you may use. You would choose, depending on the situation. By the way, I'm quite curious. I read several articles about critical incident stress debriefing, and there was a little bit of a criticism saying that critical incident stress debriefing is not that good for a so-called non-organized group like civilians. For instance, we had the incident and we have a group of people, but we most likely won't have any good approach to them several weeks or months later after the incident. But it works pretty well with organized groups like police or military or other professionals. So what's your understanding? Why it is so? How does it work?
Okay, so I'm an international elite instructor in critical incident stress management. So I would say to you that it's a peer-driven group.
Okay.
So that means there has to be pre-incident education around what interventions are going to take place. So both management, middle management, and employees, be the military or civilian, it doesn't matter what the organization is, that it's there. Because part of the program of a debriefing, if you're carrying out a debriefing, and debriefing is only just one aspect of it, is that you follow up with people. And it's on that peer-to-peer basis. So if you have a group of non-peer supporters, in other words, if you have a non-homogeneous group, if you have a heterogeneous group, which is a mixed group, no, debriefing should not be carried out with heterogeneous groups. So in other words, if I look at what we did in Beirut, the people that were walking by, they're a separate group. What they need is psychoeducation. And we call that a crisis management briefing, where we just push information out to those people, because you can actually harm them more. They may not be ready for it, and there will be no follow-up, and there has to be a follow-up in relation to it. So you will find that in a lot of organizations throughout the world, like the organizations you mentioned, the military, the police, the emergency services, certain schools, they have a trained peer support program within it, and that's where it should be done. But where it's a heterogeneous group, debriefing should not be carried out.
Okay, I understood. Excellent. If we're talking about timeline of crisis, which you mentioned,
Mhm.
and we're talking about the groups of people on the scene, what do you think could be the base stabilization or grounding techniques you use? I mean, based on your professional experience, what really works and what doesn't?
Yeah. So what I would say to you here is stabilization is the most important aspect of it. Because if you can't ground people or stabilize them, then they're not going to be able to take the information in, and they're not going to be able to go anywhere. Even in ordinary therapy yourself, you know that when you meet somebody, until that trust is developed, that person won't actually move anywhere forward with you until it is there. So the key part there is in the initial stages is gaining that trust. That's the key. They have to trust you. And can I just say, from a military point of view, it is essential. We in the military, we have a distrust of civilians and what they're going to write about us for some reason. I think it's bred into us in early training. So you have to develop that trust. For your comrades and colleagues that are serving in the military at the moment in Ukraine, in the initial stages, talk to them about their experience. Recognize their service to their country. Recognize the loss that they have suffered on behalf of their country. I don't think we do this enough when we meet our veterans and we meet our serving personnel from that aspect of it. So in the early stages, teaching them how to regulate their arousal and their impulses. Tragically, within the military and now within some police forces, we adapt to a negative method of coping. And that is the use of alcohol and other substances. And we use these to self-medicate. So we have to be able to put in place other psychoeducation techniques for people that actually help them not to have to self-medicate, but in fact to have to regulate and control their impulses. Show them how they may be thinking in a negative way. Bring them back, that CBT training, bring them back to the basis of the A, B, C, and the D. So their A is what they're doing. They automatically go to C without thinking what B is, and we bring in D to change their thoughts. We need to be able to do that. But we need to be able to explain that to them in an easy term, that the person that we're serving, be the civilian or military, that they can understand the changing of their thought process. Because I believe we as humans were wired negatively. We go to the negative side so easy, and we just need to teach people in that approach how to bring them back onto it. We also need to show them how to put the brakes on, how to slow life down. Because in your country at the moment, I can only imagine, after serving in Lebanon and Darfur, as you mentioned earlier on, and other places around the world, I can only imagine the pace. And I'm not talking about the pace of life. I'm talking about the pace of thinking. Will I be here tomorrow? Where are my family? How many of your serving personnel have families overseas because of the war? So families are disrupted. So to show them that thinking, that aspect of it, and to treat them and show them the risks of being individuals as well. So there's multiple techniques. If I was to look at PTSD, I would take each of the interventions and I would give them specific mental health training and psychoeducation training on each of those areas. So that's the way I would work with it.
Okay, excellent. Talking about the PTSD approaches, So would you use also multifaceted approach to take when dealing with, you know, diagnosed PTSD or other stress related disorders, or you find some of the approaches to be